Well, hello there, everybody. How are we this fine evening? I hope you're enjoying the seasonal transition into the crisp autumn air. Because if you're anything like me, boy, do you enjoy that. And boy, do you also enjoy mouthing cliches about the change in weather while you try to kill time as people enter into a live stream, which I fully admit is what I'm currently doing. Well, thanks as always for tuning in, and I wanted to begin by touching on a subject that I don't see much commentary about, and I don't see much consternation about, and I have a speculative theory as to why I don't get the impression that this issue really matters to much of the media class. And thank you for the commenter who saw me on Jimmy Dore recently. Yes, appearing. I'll interrupt myself just to say that, of course, appearing on Jimmy Dore does become a cathartic experience for me because I know that I'll be able to rant unhindered and let off some steam, which is what I did on Jimmy Dore this week. So take a look at that if you're interested. But the reason why the subject I'm about to bring up doesn't get remarked on very much in the media, anyways, because most of the people who are in the media would have the access or would have the proximity that I'm theorizing is being increasingly deprived of ordinary people, right? So what do I mean? Well, during the 2020 presidential campaign, I would go around and try to cover Joe Biden's presidential campaign events, the Biden-Harris ticket events. I also covered Trump events, but when I would cover Biden events, what happened was something new, something that didn't have any recognizable precedent in the history of American presidential campaigns, which is that the location and even at times the time, the basic logistical details that would enable members of the public to attend these Biden presidential campaign events, they were being conspicuously hidden. They were kept secret. And although these events were being held for the cameras largely, they were fairly drastically different from what would have ordinarily been the case with presidential campaign events, right? You would either, you'd see a flyer somewhere in the older days, right? Or now, more recently, you'd see a Facebook event, or you'd see these events advertised somewhere in the public sphere that you could easily research and find out about. And if you wanted to attend just as a normal citizen, you could. Biden and Harris totally upended that entire model of presidential campaigning, which is a huge departure, as far as I know, from anything really that preceded it in U.S. history. If you're a historian out there and you have a vast wealth of knowledge about the intricacies of American presidential campaign procedure throughout the ages, let me know. But as far as I can gather, it was unprecedented for them to hold these putatively public campaign events and then hide the information as to how the public even attends those events so as to keep them kind of quasi-private. What they did was these events, if you just consume them in the media, had the appearance of being public, but a standard American citizen who didn't have any connections, didn't have any inside information, didn't have somebody they could call up and request a favor from, they were excluded more or less from these events. So, for example, I tried to get into a Biden event that was being held along with John Bon Jovi last October, about a year ago, in northeastern Pennsylvania. And what would happen is this event would get announced like the day before, right? So you couldn't really plan to go. You couldn't arrange logistical stuff ahead of time in order to go. You had to kind of, on super short notice, just happened to come across the information that this event was possibly going to be held somewhere in the area. But then the interesting thing was, you'd look at, I would happen to be in the area at the time, right? So I got, I've read this newspaper report from a local newspaper saying that Biden was going to be in the area the following day. And bizarrely, it didn't contain any details. It didn't contain the address of where Biden was going to appear. It didn't obtain any information about how one might go through the process of figuring out how to attend if they so chose. It didn't contain an exact time. It was very oddly vague. And the only reason I was able to figure out where this event was because I did some sleuthing, right? I mean, I did sleuthing that shouldn't be required to figure out where a campaign event for a major party nominee was going to be held. But I did that, and I figured out that it was being held at this high school in this town called Dallas, Pennsylvania, in Luzerne County. So I went, and it was one of these so-called drive-in events. I don't know if you recall this, but during that COVID era, which we're still in to some extent, but then Biden insisted and Democrats insisted that they had to radically overturn everything that they had done previously in terms of holding public campaign events, and they would hold these outdoor drive-in events. And how did you gain access to these events? Well, once I showed up to this high school in Dallas, Pennsylvania, and tried to enter, not as a member of the media, which I could have done if I wanted to, just as a member of the general public to see what the process would be, I ended up getting a campaign worker to spill the beans. And this campaign worker revealed to me that the only people allowed into this exclusive confab with Joe Biden and John Bon Jovi were party officials and donors. That's what this worker told me. I reported on it at the time. Few people seemed to care really because they were focused on other things maybe, or they didn't see the long-term implications. But what I was told by this campaign worker was that only VIPs essentially were being permitted to come to this event. And I said, you know what? That's very peculiar. That is unusual, to say the least, for a major party's presidential campaign events. But it was notable that I got that information out of this campaign worker, and it could then be analyzed as to what this new mode or model of campaigning portended for just the ability of average citizens to engage in the political process. Not that attending a campaign event, especially a presidential campaign event, is all that illuminating. But, if you're a citizen, really what you should have the right to do is just attend if you so please. If you support the candidate, if you oppose them, if you're neutral, if you just want to observe, whatever, that should be within your purview to do. And that was being restricted supposedly on the grounds of public health, right? Because it was supposedly a temporary COVID measure that necessitated this new model of campaigning. And yet, what were they doing? Well, they were having these outdoor distance events. So it wouldn't be some kind of epidemiological necessity for only party officials or donors or VIPs to gain access to these events, right? They're going to be distanced anyway. So it was really, they used that as the stated rationale, the ostensible rationale. But what they effectively did, what they functionally did with how they ran these events, was that they made them exclusive kind of perks for political insiders, for party officials, for donors, etc. And that's just not how it worked in the past with these public campaign rallies. I don't know if you've ever been to them before 2016 or rather 2020, but Democrat, Republican, you could show up. Sometimes they would say that you had to register when you really didn't. That's just a tactic, which actually Trump really played up, of gathering emails, addresses, and such. No, you're able to get in a public event, whether or not you give them your information. So actually bear that in mind for the future. But anyway, it wasn't this whole lengthy process where you had to talk to a friend of a friend and see if it would be possible for them to sneak you in, right? Or you were getting some kind of patronage reward from your local Democratic Party committee, and that enabled you to get in. This was new, and this was sold to the public on the grounds of public health. And I saw it repeated multiple times. Like, for example, I also went to the suburban Atlanta a bit later on in the campaign cycle. And one day, one afternoon, Kamala Harris was going to be there doing another ostensibly public campaign event that turns out, lo and behold, was actually another one of these quasi private affairs. And so I went to a Democratic Party field office. So people who are volunteering their time to phone bank, to canvass, to run the office, distribute paraphernalia, etc., even they were left in the dark as to where this event was being held or how they could attend. And it was like basically 10 minutes away from their office. And what they told me was that the people going to these events were more and more just public, party insiders from the area who could give away, a perk to their friend or their professional associate or whomever, family member. And they're the ones who are getting this quasi-exclusive access to these events that in the past were just presumptively public, but no longer. And so that really that whole dynamic was largely overlooked by the media because, if they want to get a media press pass, they can figure something out, most likely. They're not looking at the race, the presidential race, that is, through the lens of how an average citizen engages with it. So they don't see anything as having really been deprived. Well, that's what I did. And it was in keeping with my general approach to political events, which is that unless I absolutely must get a press pass in order to attend, which does happen on occasion, I will generally go through whatever entrance the public must go through, just to get the experience and not to kind of segregate myself into this cloistered media subclass. And kind of like put this arbitrary distance between myself and the ordinary people experiencing the political event. And so what I wrote about this week on Substack, which I will link to in the description box of this video, is how this whole method of campaigning or public appearances for Joe Biden in particular, but also it's going to have wider implications for other public officials as well, how that's being perpetuated even now in the supposedly post-COVID era, or the era where COVID is not supposed to be a massive emergency anymore, but is. So I'm going to post the link to Rokfin here in the comments. There we go. And in order to get the rest of the video, you will have to transition over to Rokfin. It's rokfin.com/mtracy. And so I will continue there in a moment. See you over at Rokfin, which is a wonderful service.